2022 has been the year where we've seen the importance of protecting nature fill our screens, our homes, and our workplaces. And events like COP27 and COP15, the UN global summits addressing environmental issues, are a step in the right direction. But is any of this enough? There are ongoing questions around who is responsible for tackling biodiversity loss and deforestation. And as climate activist Greta Thunberg recently said, this is the age of the great greenwashing machine. So with that in mind, how can we prevent greenwashing? Our next report addresses these issues while also looking at where investors could be part of the solution.
An area of Amazon rainforest roughly the size of a football pitch is now being cleared every minute.
Heavy monsoon rains and melting glaciers have left nearly a third of this country underwater.
Record temperatures are having catastrophic consequences. Despite targeting a 1.5 degree limit on rising temperatures, we're currently on track for a 4-degree warmer world.
Almost a fifth of human carbon emissions are coming from this. All we have to do is not burn down forests.
September 2022 saw the worst fires in the Amazon rainforest for more than a decade, and human-caused destruction is only accelerating.
We cannot ignore the fact that the developing world accounts for 2/3 of global emissions, and those emissions are rising.
Global leaders are now racing to bring in regulation, policy and targets to tackle the problem.
But it's not just down to governments. More than 3,000 companies have set emission reduction targets. But we think that markets are still underestimating the role that nature plays in the net zero transition. Nature-related risks and climate-related risks are deeply interlinked. Climate change is the third driver of biodiversity loss after land use change and overexploitation of living organisms.
Carbon offsetting could be carbon avoidance projects, which reduce emissions that would have been released into the atmosphere, or carbon removal projects that directly remove carbon from the atmosphere. But neither is perfect, and offsets can't be used in place of a strategy to reduce emissions.
A key challenge, particularly for avoidance projects, is that it's really hard to demonstrate that they wouldn't have happened anyway. Each offset should represent a ton of carbon that would have otherwise been emitted, which is often referred to as additionality. So for example, a renewables project that's already financially viable wouldn't pass the test, and nor would protecting an area of forest that's not really at risk of destruction. For nature-based solutions, low-quality projects like forest monocultures, where rows and rows of the same tree are planted, can have devastating impacts on ecological diversity. But when they're implemented and managed responsibly, they can have important co-benefits both for biodiversity as well as local communities, and represent an exciting opportunity for tangible action on climate and nature together.
It is not a secret that COP26 is a failure.
While trying to find solutions, many companies and countries have found themselves facing accusations that they're outsourcing problems or misstating the impact. And we're only just starting to understand how to measure avoided emissions. So whichever way you look at it, there's a lot to refine when considering nature as an asset. Joining me now in the studio is Andy Howard, the Global Head of Sustainable Investing at Schroders. Now, Andy, in that report, we saw that there's a real issue with measuring the impact of nature. Are you finding any solutions in this space when it comes to individual companies?
Well, it's certainly the case that it's improving very quickly. If I go back just a few years, nature and biodiversity was something that we could talk about in broad terms, but frankly, measuring them or quantifying them for individual companies or individual investments was pretty much impossible. That's changed really quickly. So we've had initiatives like TNFD, Global Canopy, CDP, which are initiatives that have been set up to really try and coordinate the information that companies provide, and therefore the materials that we as investors have to better understand companies and to better understand investments. So it's changed very quickly in terms of the disclosure by companies. We're also seeing much more focus across our whole industry on how we use that information to make better assessments and better judgments about companies. There are no singular answers. There's still an awful lot more work to do. And one of the areas that we've been very focused on in Schroders is how do we build the scorecards, how do we build the measurement systems that give us a better understanding of which companies are more exposed to nature risks and biodiversity risks, and which companies are managing those risks more effectively, in order that we can have a clearer view of where those risks are biggest and therefore where we should be focusing our attention when we're engaging with those companies.
You mentioned a couple of initiatives there. I wondered if you could give us a bit more information. What are they? What are their focuses?
Absolutely. Well, so if you go back, look over the last sort of 10, 15 years, there's been a huge focus on climate change. So you've had initiatives like CDP, which was previously the Carbon Disclosure Project, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, all of which have really been about trying to drive more disclosure and more consistent disclosure by companies around climate change. Over the last few years, that focus has broadened, and necessarily broadened, to include other areas of nature and other areas of biodiversity. So, for example, there's a CDP forest initiative, very similar to their climate one. TNFD is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And those are initiatives that are creating similar kinds of structure, similar kinds of information, consistency of information for companies around nature-related or biodiversity-related disclosures.
And then as more people get involved in this topic and more stakeholders are involved, there is the issue of greenwashing. So where do you stand on this? How do we avoid greenwashing?
The antidote to greenwashing really is transparency and honesty. We have to be clear that the information that we have today and the analysis that we can apply is not perfect. There is an awful lot more to do. And when we're talking to our clients, when companies are reporting information, it's critical that we recognize and that we're very clear that the measures that we're able to apply today are imperfect. They only tell part of the picture, and that we will continue focusing on how do we make that analysis better, how do we make that more complete over time. But it's critical, I think, that we don't let a lack of perfect information stop us from taking action.
So we can hear that you're passionate about this, but for people watching at home, can you tell us why you think it's important that people invest in nature?
Well, I think there's two elements to this. I think the first thing I'd say is we are all exposed to nature. You don't really have a choice about whether the investments that you have are exposed to nature or not. The reality is that companies, economies, industries over several decades and indeed longer have been built up and have grown through an unsustainable use of natural resources and natural capital. And the cracks in that model, in a model that relies on depleting nature's capital, are becoming much clearer. And we're seeing a response to that from governments, from societies, that's putting real pressure on those companies whose business models and whose growth has relied on using finite natural capital. So we're all exposed. The only real question is, do we recognize that exposure? Are we trying to measure it? And are we taking steps to manage it? And really that's our focus. So to my mind, actually the question isn't so much, should we be exposed or should we think about our exposure to or choose to be exposed to nature? The reality is we are all exposed to nature. The only question is, have we realized that and are we taking steps to manage that? There is a second part to this, which is how can we as investors start allocating and investing in the solutions to nature's challenges? How can we actually look at investing into initiatives that will help regenerate forestry, will help regenerate nature in different parts of the world? And there's a whole area of our industry that I think will have to become much more important in the future that will help to channel capital into the solutions to many of those problems that will help not only limit the loss or limit the flow, but will also help us to rebuild, in some cases, nature that has been lost in the past.
Thanks, Andy. That's all we've got time for in this episode. So the problem is a big one, but there are positives to be drawn in the innovation that's taking place at the moment, and also the data that's now being collected. So over the next few years, we should see some opportunities in this space. Thanks for watching.